If you grew up watching a certain yellow sponge, you may believe that F is for friends who do stuff together. I'm here to tell you that's wrong. F actually stands for film sensitivity. So what is film sensitivity and why do we talk about film when we're shooting with digital cameras? When we say film, what we're referring to is the sensor inside and how reactive it is to light. The reason we call it film sensitivity when we think about it is that before we had digital cameras, we had film cameras, and film was made from different manufacturers in different countries with different formulas. And we all know different formulas always provide the same result, right? No. So in 1974, the International Organization for Standardization developed a system for standardizing light sensitivity in film from the ASA and DIN systems, which were the two major competitors in America and Europe. So what that did was created a system where each number has its own reactivity to light and it matches across the board. And then when they made digital cameras, they made everything mesh together and created the ISO. So in our videos on shutter speed and aperture, we talked about how those control the amount of light reaching the sensor. What the ISO controls is how reactive the sensor is. So when we see ISO, your camera probably has a button on it on the top that says ISO somewhere, or a setting in the menus where you can control it with a turn dial or a wheel. The lower the ISO, the less reactive it is to light. The higher the ISO, the more reactive it is to light, right? So you've already used your shutter speed and your aperture to control the amount of light coming into the sensor and reaching the sensor. Now you're controlling how sensitive the sensor is reading that light, right? So if you are in a bright daytime setting, you're probably shooting at 100, 200, a very low sensitivity because there's a lot of light being produced that's still reaching it. If you're shooting at nighttime, you're probably bumping your ISO up pretty significantly and getting some higher numbers. So the other thing that this controls is it controls not only how reactive it is to light, but the texture and the quality of image. So when you increase the ISO, you get what's called grain in your photo, or noise. You hear it called noise or grain. And you'll see it in some photos that are shot in lower light, where you get this kind of staticky look to the picture, and the higher the ISO, the more grain that's going to appear in your image. And there are ways to fix this and combat it in post, so you can still shoot with higher ISO and then go back and fix it later. But just know that the higher your ISO, the more noise or grain that you're going to get in your images. Okay, so all of these were shot with a Canon R6 Mark II with a 15mm lens. So our first image was shot at ISO 100, 50mm, f2.5, and then the shutter speed was 1/100th of a second. As you can see, it's a clear image. There's not a lot of noise. There's not a lot of grain or grit in the picture. It's just nice, and the sensor did its job well. Our next image we're going to look at is ISO 320. In this one, same thing, 50mm lens, f-stop didn't change, still 2.5. Shutter speed also moved up to account for the increasing in sensitivity of the sensor, right? We wanted to keep the exposure the same, so we had to adjust shutter speed to match the adjustment in ISO. Again, a very relatively clear image. There's not a whole lot of noise to complain about in this one. Now we jump to 1600. If we look at the temple of the skull, we start to see some of that grain filtering in the shadows. So ISO is 1600, still the same lens, and the aperture is the same size. We had to move our shutter speed up to match it, so the shutter speed is now 1600 as well. We come up to our fourth image. We've bumped up and doubled our ISO. We're at 3200. If you look, you can start to see grit and grain in the temple and in the area underneath the leaves a lot. Shutter speed moved up to 3200 as well to match the adjustment in ISO. Aperture stayed the same. Now we get into the higher ISOs. Now we're at 32,000, right? This is like if you're shooting at night or in like an arena with really bad lighting or somewhere where there's not a whole lot of light to use in the first place. Adjust the shutter speed, max out at 1/8000th. I didn't feel like putting on the electric shutter, I just left it on mechanical. So we had to move the aperture to 5.0. So we doubled the aperture and we've maxed out our shutter speed. So now our ISO to account for this image is at 32,000. We see a significant amount of grain appearing in both the highlights and shadows. There's just that like staticky, ripply texture across the whole image. And then max out ISO at 102,000 with an f of 9.0 and then 1/8000th of a second for the shutter speed. There's significant grain. Keeping in mind that this is relative to the camera and how it performs. Different cameras have different sensors have different textures of noise. Some of them are very pointillism, some of them have weird like snaky lines to them. It's just different. But the thing to keep in mind is that each sensor has its own limits and capabilities on how far you can push it before you start to get noise. Like shutter speed and aperture, how you use ISO and when you use it is going to give you a different result. but I hope this video has helped you understand its functionality and its purpose in photography a little bit better. Remember, respect your gear, your spot, your subject, and most importantly, yourself. Love you guys. Take care.